Right, Adam Walton's interview with Clem Burke, drummer of Blondie, coming up after Blondie.
I saw you standing on the corner.
That's Blondie and Ex-Offender, which is where I assume it kind of all started for you, Clem, and the band, at least in terms of releases. What memories does that song in particular evoke for you?
Well, it was one of our earliest songs, original songs, and it was co-written by Debbie and my high school mate, Gary Valentine, who I got into the band based on his literary expertise more than anything else. He sat down and read a few of his poems to the three of us. And he had never really played the bass before. He was a bit of a folky. He could play acoustic guitar, and he loved David Bowie. And so he came up with the music to that song. And Debbie, we had a mutual friend who actually was involved in a case, kind of was portrayed in the song. And for that song, it's still very one of my favorite songs. And it also, I always say, it really wasn't the sound of Blondie live at CBGB. It was the sound of Blondie in a recording studio making a record and showing basically the world what we could do in the studio. And it's a bit of a homage to the whole wall of sound, Phil Spector wall of sound. And it was always very exciting for me to hear the song on the jukebox at the time at the club CBGB, because there were very few recordings of the bands that played at CBGB on that jukebox. There was a band, Television had an independent single, Patti Smith had an independent single, maybe the first Ramones song, Blitzkrieg Bop, and then most of the other songs on the jukebox were kind of, garage rock and things you would expect, Iggy and the Stooges or Velvet Underground, things like that. So I always remind myself of how excited I was to hear it being played over the speakers in the club. So it's a very... it got our foot in the door as well, that song.
It's interesting that you mention all of those artists, Patti Smith, Television, such a broad range of music came out of CBGB at the time. And, like lumped together under new wave, under punk, whatever way these things are labelled. And yet that variety in Talking Heads, of course, was and Suicide, it was always kind of part of that scene in particular. Did that mean that things like being able to adopt influences from the Wall of Sound and Phil Spector sound were easier? You could be more exploratory with Blondie.
Well, we could. Our musical palette is very large. We have a very large range in what we sort of aspire to and what we're inspired by. And of the handful of bands that reached sort of worldwide prominence, you're right. Each band was quite different from the other, but I think at the same time, we were all being influenced by one another. And the club itself, it was a place where you could make your mistakes in public, which was very important. Of course, today, that would be a different world with everyone having a camera and things like that, especially for, comedians, for instance. They can't really workshop their act in public because, someone's going to record it and the jokes, you'll know the jokes before they get on stage, for instance. So, the Ramones would argue with one another on stage, and we weren't, as I was mentioning, we weren't the greatest live band at the time. We had a lot of things going for us, obviously, with a fantastic front person, and the energy of the whole scene kind of propped everyone up, as time went on and everyone kind of got their act together, let's say. I still to this day think if it had not been for the entire scene that was going on the Lower East Side in the mid-'70s, that we wouldn't have had the success that we've had with Blondie. It was all basically very bohemian. You get people like Debbie, for instance, she was basically a beatnik. And then, of course, Patti Smith with her poetry, as I mentioned, Gary, very much influenced by people like Ginsberg and, Burroughs and people like that. And that was really a big influence on the whole New York scene in the mid-'70s.
Can we talk about one of your influences, which I think, although not immediately apparent on Ex-Offender, it's kind of then in the signature way that you drum, because Hal Blaine from the Wrecking Crew drummed on so many amazing records over the years, but he had a way, I suppose you had to make the most of your time, serve the song when you were recording quickly in those studios with all of these amazing artists, but also add kind of a signature note, something that was recognisable in your part, and you always seem to have been able to do that. So many of your drum patterns are really recognisable and kind of like riffs in their own right. Is that something that you got from Hal? Is that part of your philosophy as a drummer, or have I completely misinterpreted things?
No, well, I've cited Hal along with Earl Palmer, the other really well-known session drummer from that era. Earl, having played with Little Richard and Fats Domino and people like that at the studio in New Orleans. He was the house drummer there, very similar to Hal being the house drummer for Phil in L.A. And then Earl eventually migrated to Los Angeles. And also, actually, I think he was the one who originally brought Hal into the Wrecking Crew, because Earl Palmer also played on things like River Deep Mountain High and with Phil and things like that. But yes, there was a signature attitude or sound with Hal. And it's been said, Spector would tell him to kind of hold back until the end, and then kind of at the end of the song kind of explore various drum riffs and things. And then, of course, we mentioned Ex Offender. The beginning is evocative of a song called My Boyfriend's Back that our producer at the time, Richard Goddard, wrote. But the drum intro is basically a steal from Hal and Be My Baby by the Ronettes. And, that was really one of the main early influences of Blondie, was the girl group sound, along with the garage rock of, say, the Velvet Underground and people like that. And also there was a bit of what we call bubblegum pop, in it as well, whether it be the Bay City Rollers, who were very much influenced the Ramones, by the way. And a lot of the whole litany of U.S. bubblegum bands like 1910 Fruit Gum Company. I mean, Talking Heads used to do a song called 1, 2, 3 Red Light. That was a song by the 1910 Fruit Gum Company and all that. And then, all that sort of glam rock, bubblegum glam rock, like, the Swede, Show Waddy Waddy and things like that, which was very, very unknown in America, but we were influenced by things like that as well.
That's amazing, because I'm interviewing you from Wrexham, which is a town in North Wales, and Andy Scott from was from Wrexham, and Wrexham doesn't really have a musical history as such. Lots of great bands around at the moment, but he's kind of the key name from that past. But very rarely, the Sweets are very rarely mentioned by bands in the UK, because that kind of thing was so commercial. It was never regarded as cool. But it's interesting when it then goes over the water, and you're free to interpret it and be influenced by it regardless of cool, aren't you? Which is, I suppose, one of the exciting things. So, can we talk a little bit about the differences? We will talk about the music that you've made more contemporarily, but just looking back at the past, maybe the differences between UK punk. UK punk had this thing about encouraging people who couldn't play to make music anyway. It seems that when Blondie formed, was it like 74, 75? Obviously, that was pre-punk anyway.
Right.
But you all seem to be great players. A lot of those people you mentioned, Tom Verlaine and television, they're kind of the best, the very, very best at what they did. So did UK punk, share anything of the ethos or the attitude that you had in the States in CBGB?
Well, I mean, as time went on a little bit, UK punk did have a vast influence on the whole sort of American punk scene. But we were kind of predecessors to all of that, as you mentioned. And there were so-called punk bands. To us, a punk band was a band like the Music Machine, a band that had a song called Talk Talk, or obviously, Iggy and the Stooges and things like that. So, and the word punk, had various meanings, prior to the phrase being coined. And I don't know exactly who was the first to say punk rock exactly, but
probably Lester Bangs.
Obviously, the Ramones kind of, maybe Lester Bangs, right? Lester wrote a great book about Blondie, I think, over a 2.5-day binge when he was commissioned to do a biography about the band. It's probably pretty hard to find, but it's out there. As I said, the diversity of the bands in New York were taking from what came before. And television, we did our first UK tour, supporting them. And to me, they were very much, as you mentioned, virtuoso guitar players. And they're kind of very influenced by, even by the Grateful Dead, for instance, which was about as outside of punk rock as you could get at the time. And I think we just, we were taking from the past and moving it forward where, there was a pretense in the UK of everything begins again in 1977. Obviously, the Clash singing about no Elvis, Beatles, or the Rolling Stones. Meanwhile, we were all influenced by all that stuff, as they were, obviously, but had a pretense of not being so. And, it was just, as I said, the CBGB was like a workshop. So, we used to cover a song by Television called Venus de Milo. And, we used to cover Ramones songs that, hadn't really been released yet, just that we had heard them playing in the club and said, oh, that's a great song. Maybe we should try to do a cover of that. You never know. So it wasn't based on one attitude or one style in, the so-called US punk scene, whereas I think, as I mentioned, there was a template for the UK punk scene, and the whole idea of you didn't have to be that great. We incorporated, as I said, our original bass player, Gary Valentine. He never played bass before. And I'm glad. Thank you for saying that everyone was such great musicians, but at the time, some were more than others at that particular time. For instance, Tommy Ramone never played the drums until he joined the Ramones. He went on to form a band where he was playing mandolin. So you never know what's behind the scenes,
Yeah. Well, let's.
It had to do with style. It really had to do with style. Like the New York scene was very influenced by Warhol and people like that as well, and a certain aesthetic existed, within the city, but it was very insular.
Well, let's play our second choice. I'm going to play Doom or Destiny off the most recent album, Pollinator, from back in the day. So we'll do that, and we'll talk with you again in just a moment's time, Clem. So that's Blondie and Doom or Destiny. Hugely recognisably Blondie, obviously, and Pollinator is such a great album. Clem, how receptive are your audience when you're doing the gigs that you're gearing up for now? How receptive are they to the excellent new music that you've made?
Well, we are trying to dig a little deeper with the more recent music within the context of the set, but of course, actually, in August, we're having, for the first time, an archival box coming out of the first 6 Blondie albums that we all participated in developing and interviewing for, and finding old photographs and outtakes and things like that. So the tour is called Against the Odds, basically based upon the title of the archive, which was due to the fact that any kind of success in, the arts, let's call it, is really against the odds. It's really, the percentage of people that manage to break through and to have the kind of success that we had with Blondie is very, very small, obviously. And then, of course, with the recent events in the last couple of years, it was against the odds that the tour would ever happen. So therefore, we named the tour Against the Odds. It all seemed to kind of go hand in hand. But the Pollinator record was received really, really well by critics, and also, did fairly well in the States. We had the single Long Time, which is a great song, which I'm sure we're going to be doing in our upcoming show. And the audience does seem to, especially with the Pollinator record, we made a point of all being together in the studio and doing pre-production. And of course, most of the songs were from outside writers, which was very unusual for us. Although we have a history doing cover songs, i.e. Hanging on the Telephone or Tide is High or Denis as well. This is the first time we really kind of more or less solicited outside material and went into the studio as a band and did the tracks basically in the way we used to do it, where everyone played together and laid down the basic tracks and then overdubbed or edited later on. And that song that you just played, Doom of Destiny, is one of my favorites on the record. And that, to me, that is kind of a punk rock song in a way, kind of influenced by the Ramones a little bit. And when we were in the studio, I had suggested, that our friend Joan Jett might be a good person to have sing along with Debbie on that track, when Joan was nice enough to do that. And that all worked out. So,
yeah.
Pollinator goes hand in hand with the way we make records. It's very eclectic. It's all over the place. There's the song Fun, which is a great sort of dance song. And then there's, all kinds of stuff. Best Day Ever is one of my favorites that was co-written by one of the kids from the Strokes. And I really like that song a lot. I think Nick, the guitarist from the Strokes, co-wrote that song with Sia, I believe.
Okay, that's a broad cast of people.
It is
from across the generations. Well, is there any? Some bands, when you're speaking to them and they're touring and they've got big hits from their past that they play, it's not so much resentment. Everyone seems very, very grateful to have struck those moments. As you said, against all odds, that combination of luck, serendipity, talent, amazing production, whatever it is that's happening in the water at the time. So is it always relatively easy to put together a playlist that satisfies a set list rather that satisfies all the things that you want to do, or is it always a challenge?
It's a bit of a challenge because you want to play the songs that people are familiar with, the hits, which we do like to play. Actually, to play them in front of an audience is always a joy because, the response is amazing. But we do try to look for stuff that people may be less familiar with. And I think we've reached a happy medium on this show we've just been rehearsing for the upcoming UK tour. And interestingly enough, I don't know how many hits we've had in the UK, but we've had quite a few. Quite a few were number one as well, I believe. But in the States, the history of our hit records has been a little different. So there's a lot of songs, for instance, like Picture This or Sunday Girl, that were never really released as singles in the US or were hits for that matter. And then whereas in the UK, they were big hits. So we're kind of designing the set to make our UK fans very, very happy. And we might alternate a bit when we go, it's an interesting phenomenon with Blondie. I mean, we've had 4 number one singles in the United States, and each one had nothing to do with the sound of the other one, for instance, like Part of Glass, Call Me, Rapture, Tide is High. They're all different sort of genres, and none of them are really typical of what people may think of what the Blondie sound is if you kind of go back to our roots. So it's an interesting place to be in. And particularly in America, there's a lot of those songs, as I mentioned, are not as well known. Although, for instance, we do a track off of Parallel Lines and Chris says, like, Pretty Baby or something. And Chris will say, well, nobody knows that song. I'm like, well, Chris, the album sold like how many millions of copies? Everyone knows that song on Parallel Lines, even though it wasn't a single, So it's kind of funny. It goes back and forth like that when you try to put the set together.
And what's it like? What's it like in rehearsals, Clem? I mean, can you compare the experience of being in a room playing with these people now to when you were first in a room? I would imagine they're very different types of room, but in essence, the chemistry is probably still very similar. The personalities are still similar, obviously a little bit older and wiser, but there must be still something very recognisably the DNA that you remember from those early days. I'm assuming, anyway.
Oh, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, Chris, Debbie, and I have a very, very long history. They're both a couple of years older than me, although none of us are particularly young any longer, which is kind of hard to believe. But so they're kind of like my older brother and sister in a lot of, I don't mean for that to sound kind of a cliche, but it really kind of is in a lot of ways that they are related to me in that way. And there's a lot of history that went on through the years. But, that's so funny, like just, the reissue or the re-release of the whole Peter Jackson Get Back, with the Beatles, not to compare Blondie to the Beatles, but you could compare that movie to like what it's like with any band where it's actually a band exchanging ideas and, the resentments and the love and the jokes and it all kind of, I find myself after watching that again, like I feel like I'm in that movie all the time when I'm in a rehearsal with a band. It's kind of funny because there are very obvious things that are going to happen between a handful of musicians that are sharing a creative process together when no one's kind of quote unquote the leader, let's say, which is, Blondie, although we have an amazing lead singer that stands out, as do the Rolling Stones, as did the Doors. And, but it's still a kind of a collective, it's a group as far as exchanging creativity and ideas. So you're correct in your assumption. It's a little different, but it's also very much the same these days.
Now, given the hectic touring schedule, the fact that you keep yourselves busy, do you find time amongst yourselves to write and consider new material? Because, you mentioned that the songs for Pollinator were kind of shipped in. I would imagine there's still an urge there to make new music. Again, I'm making assumptions. I mean, is the urge still there to make new music, Clem?
Well, the urge to make new music was always there upon our Reformation because it was kind of put to us that we really didn't need to do that at the time, just do another so-called greatest hits collection and maybe, put one new song on it. And when we did the album No Exit, which featured the song Maria, that came out of us completely we wanted to have something new to present to our audience when we got back together, a new creativity, some new songs. And that was kind of like at the top of our list of what to do when we did regroup back in the late 90s. And in fact, prior to the tour rehearsals, we've been in pre-production for a new record. And we have about 30 new songs all coming from within the band. And that is going to be released sometime next year. And we are definitely in the pre-production process of making a new album. And that took precedent over the tour rehearsals for a while.
Yeah.
But now the last week or so, we've been doing, playing as if we're going to be doing a show and getting everything to sound and lights together and all those other kind of things that go hand in hand with going on tour. So yeah, there's definitely new music coming from our bands, sometime next year.
Now, we're here talking because you're playing in Cardiff in Wales on the 24th of April.
Right.
Yeah, so a couple of concerts you played in North Wales, which is where I'm speaking to you from, at a place called Deeside Leisure Centre in 1980, is still regarded, and this is God's honest truth, I'm not just saying this sycophantically, but very much the pinnacle of live music in North Wales, even all of these years later. But given the many, many hundreds of gigs that you've done, probably hard to remember specific gigs. It was in an ice rink, an old ice rink, and they put carpet over it. I mean, do you remember?
I do remember that. I do remember the Deeside Leisure Centre gig. It was one of the last gigs we did before we took our break in the early 80s. And I do remember it being a phenomenal gig. And, it was just, the UK in general, it's been a big enabler for us to have the kind of career that we've had, the UK audiences took to us very early on. And that was probably the pinnacle of our tenure as a really, really successful band, when we did that tour back around that time. And I do remember it. I do recall the name of that venue. And it was a very memorable tour for sure.
Apparently the venue, I think I was 9 at the time, but apparently the venue was really, really, really cold. But is it nice, as a band to travel?
Right, because of the ice rink, yeah.
Yeah. Is it nice to play places that aren't necessarily capital cities where they're probably spoilt with culture. New York City's spoilt with culture. It's responsible for so much. But if you go to the Midwest or something, there's probably an excitement within the audience to be witnessing something that they can't find round the corner. I mean, is that the case when you're touring?
Well, yes. When we are touring, in particular, I like playing in the southern states of the United States because, coming from New York City and coming from such a artistic, sophisticated. I'm not trying to, say that people in New York City are more intelligent or better than everybody else, but there is an aspect of just you're surrounded by this immense amount of stimulation culturally, and media-wise and things like that, artistically. So, when we play in sort of more out-of-the-way states, there is a different kind of energy. And it's kind of fun to be somewhere where people think maybe that you're a little... I don't know, just something out of the ordinary, which is kind of what Blondie always has been. And of course, the whole world has been transformed into one sort of giant, kind of one giant New York City. I mean, any major city now that you go to, has an art scene, has a music scene, and, everyone's connected, obviously. I don't have to make that point. And so it's a little different, but it is fun to go and play in some places where you're seen as a little bit unusual. And because like I said, everything is kind of homogenized in a way, like being cool is kind of homogenized. Like Chris always says, when we did Heart of Glass, it was like the most uncool thing to do, the most un-punk rock thing to do. But in fact, it was even more punk rock because it kind of rubbed up against people the wrong way, or early fans, or just the whole collective of so-called punk rock musicians who were. But we always aspired to commercial success. So just to bring up like Heart of Glass, for instance, on the album on Parallel Lines, that song is not featured. It's on the second side of the album. It's basically a deep cut where we thought we were being experimental. And back in the day with an album, you would put your more, let's say, commercial songs earlier on in the record, because for the radio program, to sit there and listen to maybe the first track or the second track. But if he didn't hear something that kind of he thought would be good to play on the air, you know, in the States, I'm talking about, you know, they would not really go in much deeper into the album. So, you know, Heart of Glass was a hidden track on Parallel Lines that had phenomenal commercial success.
Well, you know, I was going to finish the conversation now by playing Fade Away and Radiate from the same from the same album, because it's not all that often played. I mean, it's very slow. I mean, when you're drumming a slower song like that, do you get as much satisfaction out of drumming on something like Fade Away and Radiate as you do on drumming on, I don't know, One Way or Another or Heart of Glass? Well,
Fade Away and Radiate is really one of all of our most favorite Blondie songs, really, of all time. You know, it has a kind of ambiance that a lot of our other material doesn't have. And I kind of put it in a category of, you know, like, well, I mean, we were influenced, you know, by Roxy Music and by David, of course, Bowie, and, you know, bands like that as well. And it's kind of a bit more art rock. And in fact, you know, our friend at the time, who was still a friend, Robert Fripp from King Crimson, plays some phenomenal, you know, guitar on that track. You know, he's so-called Frippatronics. And, you know, so it's kind of like an art rock song to me. And whether a song is fast or slow is almost irrelevant. It's what the song is broadcasting, you know, whether it be an ambiance, a very subliminal message, or just a very abstract idea. And, you know, how that song takes a certain form that has a certain, let's say, a reaction in your brain, you know, really. So that's really how that goes. But it's interesting you're going to play that, because that is a song that we all really, really like. And that is definitely in the show as well.
Excellent. Well,
Debbie used to come out in a mirror suit, and the lights would reflect it off the mirrors on her boiler suit. And it really was a great effect back in the day.
I can imagine. Clem, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you. Good luck with the rehearsals and the logistics of getting over to the UK. And just have a great day, and thank you very much for your time.
Okay, thanks, Adam.
Clem, thank you very much for your time. This then is Clem Burke and Blondie from the album Parallel Lines and Fade Away and Radiate.
Blondie on BBC Radio Wales. Clem Burke from the band chatting to Adam Walton.